A codebook is the document that makes your coding decisions visible. It tells you what your codes are, what each code means, what kinds of excerpts belong under each code, and where one code ends and another begins. A codebook is not your findings section, and it is not your final interpretation. It is the structure that helps you code consistently across your data. Without a codebook, similar excerpts can end up being labeled in different ways without you noticing. One code can start absorbing too many meanings. A decision that seemed clear in one transcript can become unclear in the next. The codebook exists to prevent that kind of drift by giving each code a visible boundary. One of the clearest ways to understand what a codebook is to look at what a real codebook entry does on the page. One entry might have a title such as Cognitive Scaffolding and Reasoning Support. Under that title comes a definition explaining what the code captures. Then come focus areas that show the kinds of things that belong there, such as breaking down complex material, reducing overload, clarifying explanations, or guiding reasoning. After that come boundary notes that show where the code stops. If the emphasis is really on confidence, the segment belongs somewhere else. If the emphasis is really on helpful features such as tone or pacing, the segment may need to be paired with a different code. That is what makes the entry function as a codebook entry rather than as a heading. It names the code, defines the code, identifies the kinds of data that belong there, and clarifies what should not be absorbed into it. A second entry might be called metacognitive confidence and self-efficacy. That code captures something different from reasoning support even though the two may appear together in the same participant response. Its definition would explain that it describes confidence, readiness, or belief in one's ability. Its focus areas might include increased confidence, reduced anxiety, feeling more capable, or recognizing growth. Its boundary notes would distinguish it from nearby codes by clarifying that if a statement is really about understanding or clarity, it belongs somewhere else, while if it is really about a change in study habits, it may need to be paired with another code. The difference matters. One code captures how the learner was helped to think. The other captures how the learner understood their own confidence or readiness. The codebook works because it makes that difference visible before the coding decision is made. These entries also show why repeated parts matter. Each entry has a title, a definition, focus areas, and boundary notes. A code name alone is not enough. A label without a definition cannot guide consistent coding. A definition without boundaries cannot prevent overlap from becoming confusion. And a code without clear signals of what belongs there remains too abstract to use well. The first thing that shapes the codebook is the research question. A codebook is not built in abstraction from the study. It is built in relation to what the study is actually asking. If the question concerns how learners experience independence when using AI tools during academic tasks, then the codebook must be oriented toward experiences, conditions, barriers, supports, tensions, and changes related to that phenomenon. The research question acts as the anchor. It tells you what kinds of data matter, and what kinds of labels are likely to be useful. From there, the next step is to create broad organizing buckets. These are called parent codes. A parent code is a broad container that helps organize the kinds of data your study is likely to include. Parent codes are not themes, and they are not final analytic claims. They are broad buckets that create structure before coding begins. In a study concerned with independence and AI use, those parent buckets might include task initiation, emotional response, communication support, barriers to independence, reliance on others, or perceived shifts in confidence. Once those parent buckets exist, the first version of the codebook can begin to take shape. At this stage, the codebook does not need to contain every code that will ever be used. It is a first version. It identifies likely working codes underneath the parent buckets and begins defining what those codes are meant to capture. A working code is a more specific code used on actual excerpts. If the parent code is the broad container, the working code is the more precise label that names what is happening within that container. This is where it helps to imagine the codebook as an actual document you are building. One entry contains the code title. Under that comes the definition, which states what the code is for. Then come the focus areas, which signal the kinds of material likely to belong there. Then come the boundary notes, which clarify where the code stops, where it overlaps, and when another code may be a better fit. The codebook becomes clearest when it is built from actual data. Suppose the research question is, how do learners with dyslexia experience independence when using AI tools during academic tasks? One parent bucket might be task initiation, because beginning a task is one part of how independence may be experienced, supported, or disrupted. You open the first transcript and come to the excerpt. If I don't break the assignment into steps, I just stare at it and can't start. The first move is to state plainly what is happening. In plain language, the participant is describing being unable to begin a task when structure is missing. Once that is clear, the next question is where this moment belongs in the codebook. A parent bucket such as task initiation makes sense because the segment is about beginning rather than finishing, understanding, or reflecting. Then you ask which working code best captures what is happening inside that bucket. A code such as difficulty starting without structure would preserve the meaning of the segment much more precisely than a broad topic label like assignment difficulty or school stress. Now the entry begins to take shape. The definition might explain that this code captures moments when a participant describes being unable or unlikely to begin a task unless structure, breakdown, clarification, or guidance is present. The focus areas might include staring at the task, not knowing how to begin, waiting because the task feels too large, or needing the task broken into steps before acting. The boundary note might clarify that this code is not for frustration after the task has already started, and not for general dislike of the assignment. That is already a usable codebook entry. It is not a final interpretation. It is a stable coding decision made visible on the page. Now suppose the next transcript contains the statement, when the AI tool breaks the directions down for me, I can start right away. The same parent bucket still applies, but the pattern is not identical. Again, the first step is to state plainly what is happening. Here, the participant is describing a form of support that helps initiation happen. The segment still belongs under task initiation, but it is not about the barrier itself. It is about the scaffold that changes the barrier. So the codebook needs a second working code, something like, AI breakdown supports initiation. The definition might clarify that this code captures moments when AI helps the learner begin a task by organizing, simplifying, or breaking directions into manageable parts. The focus areas might include clearer starting points, more manageable steps, faster movement into the task, or the shift from staring to beginning. The boundary note might clarify that this code should not be used for general confidence increases, unless the confidence is explicitly tied to starting the task, and that it differs from reasoning support if the central issue is initiation rather than understanding content. One code now captures the barrier. The other captures the support. The parent bucket stays stable, but the working codes become more precise through actual contact with the data. This kind of walk through matters because the codebook is only useful if you can move from quote to plain language description of what is happening, to parent bucket to best fit working code, and then explain why that code fits better than a nearby one. It also helps to see what a near-miss looks like, because boundaries become clearest by contrast. Imagine a segment that says, once I get going I'm fine, but if nobody explains the first part, I don't know where to start. That still fits difficulty starting without structure, because the emphasis is on not being able to begin. Now imagine a different segment that says, I was upset because after I started the assignment, I realized I didn't understand what the middle section was asking. That may sound nearby, but it is not primarily about initiation. It is about confusion during task engagement. That near-miss matters because it shows why boundaries are not an extra detail. They are what keep one code from absorbing too many different kinds of difficulty. Another issue that must be made explicit is the size of the segment being coded. A code is applied to a unit of meaning, not automatically to a whole paragraph or to a single sentence simply because the sentence ends there. Sometimes one sentence contains several layers of meaning and reasonably receives more than one code. Sometimes several sentences belong together because they are all elaborating one coherent idea. The decision is not driven by formatting. It is driven by meaning. This is also why boundaries matter so much. A codebook is only as useful as its ability to distinguish one code from another. The real work of a codebook is often less about inventing names and more about deciding where the edges of those names are. What exactly belongs here? What looks similar but should be coded elsewhere? When should two codes be applied together? When should a code be narrowed because it is beginning to absorb too many different meanings? A well-built codebook models this clearly. Its boundary notes show whether a statement should remain in one code, be paired with another, or be redirected elsewhere depending on what the emphasis of the participant's statement actually is. A response about confidence belongs differently than a response about reasoning support. A statement about helpful design features belongs differently than a statement about emotional support, even when the two overlap. Overlap, then, is not a problem to eliminate. It is something to manage. Qualitative data are often layered, and a single segment may reasonably belong to more than one code if it is carrying more than one analytic meaning. A participant may describe a feature that also increased confidence. A participant may describe emotional reassurance that also changed study strategy. A strong codebook does not erase that possibility. Instead, it clarifies when two codes can be used together, and when a nearby code may be a better fit depending on the center of emphasis in the response. At this point, the codebook begins to function as a decision tool during first-pass coding. First-pass coding simply means the first round of coding across the data. It is the early pass where you begin applying the current codebook to actual excerpts. The workflow is direct. You read the transcript, identify a meaningful segment, state in plain language what is happening in that segment, determine which parent bucket it belongs under, compare the segment to the current working codes in that bucket, and then make one of three decisions. The first possibility is that an existing code fits clearly, in which case the code is applied. The second possibility is that the segment belongs in the parent bucket, but none of the current working codes fully captures it, in which case a new working code may need to be added. The third possibility is that the fit remains uncertain, in which case the segment can be memoed and revisited after more data have been coded. Now consider a later excerpt such as, "When I use the AI tool, I don't feel so alone trying to figure it out." If the current codebook includes an emotional response bucket, but no working code that fully captures reduced isolation, then the excerpt creates pressure for refinement. You state plainly what is happening. The participant is describing AI use as reducing the feeling of being alone while working. That moment belongs under emotional response, but none of the current working codes fully captures it. So the codebook grows. A new entry may be added called Reduced Isolation through AI Support. The definition would clarify that this code captures moments when AI use reduces feelings of being alone, unsupported, or left to struggle independently. The focus areas might include feeling accompanied, less isolated, more supported while working, or less abandoned in the task. The boundary note might clarify that this code should not be used for general confidence increases, unless the core emphasis is specifically on reduced isolation. This is how a codebook becomes more precise. It does not simply accumulate more labels. It refines its ability to preserve meaningful distinctions. The developmental shift becomes even clearer when a code must be revised rather than merely added. Imagine that early in the study you created a code called tone checking through AI. At first, that may be sufficient. But over time, you notice that the excerpts under this code are not all doing the same thing. Some participants are worried about sounding rude. Others are worried about being misunderstood. Others are worried about sounding incompetent. The code begins to absorb too many different meanings. That is the point at which the codebook needs revision. You may decide to split tone checking through AI into more precise codes, perhaps one concerned with politeness management through AI, and another concerned with avoiding misinterpretation through AI. This is the moment when the difference between the first version and the later fuller version of the codebook becomes visible. The first version was created to begin the work. The later version becomes sharper because the data have exposed distinctions that were not yet visible at the start. That matters because early codebooks are provisional. The first version is not expected to be final, and it is not expected to be perfect. A first version should be usable, not complete in some absolute sense. Revision is part of analytic discipline. In practice, the first codebook needs to be stable enough to guide first-pass coding and flexible enough to change when the data make its limits visible. This is where the audit trail becomes essential. An audit trail is the written record of what changed in the analysis and why it changed. The codebook and the audit trail are not the same thing, even though they are closely related. The codebook shows the current version of the coding structure. The audit trail records how that structure changed and why. If a new code is added because existing codes did not adequately capture a recurring pattern, that change should be reflected in the current version of the codebook. But the fact that the change occurred, the reason it occurred, and the implications for already coded material belong in the audit trail. If a code is split, merged, narrowed, renamed, or redefined, that history should not disappear. It should be documented. In practical terms, an audit trail entry records the shift that the current codebook no longer shows by itself. If reduced isolation through AI support is added, the audit trail notes that the code was created because multiple excerpts described AI as reducing the feeling of being alone, and that earlier transcripts should be checked for similar segments. If tone checking through AI is split into narrower codes, the audit trail records that one broad code had begun to absorb too many different meanings, and that the split was made to preserve a clearer distinction between politeness, misunderstanding, and competence concerns. That documentation matters because it protects the analytic process from becoming invisible. A codebook that changes without record leaves no clear explanation of how the analysis evolved. A codebook that never changes at all, on the other hand, may indicate that the structure was too rigid or that meaningful distinctions were not being sharpened as the data accumulated. It is also important to keep the codebook separate from findings. A codebook is not where themes are finalized, and it is not where the larger interpretation is made. Themes come later as patterned analytic explanations built from coded data across the dataset. The codebook is meant to stabilize noticing and boundary setting, not to finish the interpretive argument before the coding has been done. So the process of creating a codebook is not a single act completed once and for all at one moment in the study. It is a staged analytic process. The research question anchors it. The parent codes provide the initial containers. The first version of the codebook establishes likely working codes and their boundaries. First, pass coding then tests those decisions against actual excerpts. As that happens, the codebook is revised to reflect distinctions that become clearer through analysis. The audit trail documents those revisions so the evolving logic of the codebook remains visible. Once that sequence is clear, the relationship between the two videos also becomes clear. Coding is the act of making the analytic decision. A codebook is the document that records, clarifies, and stabilizes those decisions. The code must be understood before the codebook can do its job.